Welcome to the HAPI seminar. I'm Adrienne Fu Berman, co-director of the Health in the Public Interest graduate program, and Dr. Adam Myers is also co-directing the program. I think many of you have already attended some of our seminars, so you know the format. Also, just wanted to let the HAPI students know that health advocacy class tomorrow will be live hybrid. So see some of you in the classroom. And we have a wonderful speaker today who's made it clear that she wants to have a dialogue with you, so that's going to be great. And Esther is going to be introducing her. So I turn this over to Esther.
Woo. All right. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Esther Priscilla Abwehi. I am a graduate student in the HAPI program, and I thank you all for joining us today. I have the absolute honor of introducing today's speaker for the HAPI seminar series, Miss Loretta J. Ross. Loretta, as she told me it is okay to refer to her, is a nationally recognized activist and scholar whose work in social and reproductive justice spans over 40 years. She is an associate professor at Smith College, where she teaches courses on white supremacy, human rights, and calling in the calling out culture. Loretta launched the Women of Color program with the National Organization for Women in the 1980s and was instrumental in creating the theory of reproductive justice in 1994. In 97, Loretta co-founded Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. She has been honored with many awards and multiple honorary doctorates throughout the years. Loretta has co-written 3 books on reproductive justice and has another book, which is called Calling in the Calling Out Culture, set to be released later this year. She is interested in how the reproductive justice framework can be used to support human rights for everyone. And also, as kind of a side note, reproductive justice has really been the guiding force through all of my graduate program and graduate studies thus far. So I'm extremely grateful for Loretta's work. Loretta is a survivor of rape and as she states, was forced to raise a child born of incest because abortion was not legal at the time. Loretta is also the survivor of sterilization abuse at age 23, where she received an IUD that was on the market despite being defective. Complications from the faulty IUD put Loretta into a coma, and when she awoke from the coma, she learned that the doctors had performed a total hysterectomy. Loretta is a model of how not only to survive the traumas of life, but to grow and flourish beyond them. In addition to being an icon in the reproductive justice movement, Loretta is a mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. She says that the one thing left on her bucket list is to see Venus and Serena Williams play tennis live. And so without further ado, I want to introduce Miss Loretta Ross. And I guess before we jump into the speaking portion, I did also want to say that, as Dr. Fuberman said, Loretta is very comfortable with having dialogue and discussion throughout today's seminar. So, and as a wealth of knowledge, I'm sure she'll say things that will spark questions that lead to deeper conversations. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. You can always use the chat, which I'll be looking at as well. And if you want, you can use the raise hand function, which is located in the reactions button on the bottom right of the Zoom screen. So thank you so much for being here, and take it away, Loretta.
Well, I'm honored to be able to speak to Adrienne's class. She and I go back. We're co-conspirators in trying to change health policy in the United States. I remember when I met Adrienne before she became a medical doctor. And we were both on the board of the National Women's Health Network. And the National Women's Health Network, which you've heard about from Cindy Pearson, monitors the drugs and device approval process for things that are intended for women's use. And so Adrienne so impressed me because she was one of our fiercest, most knowledgeable advocates, but she was so frustrated. She said, I'm going to medical school and I'm going to get a doctorate so they'll listen to me. I said, now that's the most interesting reason I've ever heard anybody give for going to medical school. So you can become a more credentialed advocate. And I think that speaks to her heart, speaks to her passion, speaks to her love of teaching. Because obviously you could hang up a shingle and make a bunch of more money than any school is ever going to pay you. I appreciate that. So anyway, it was through what happened to me because of the Dowcon shield and the sterilization that my plumbing finally got my attention. I actually majored in chemistry and physics, courses that I'm sure y'all are very familiar with. I had to take organic chemistry twice because I couldn't stand a 5-hour D on my transcript because that damn nomenclature and that damn carbon molecule pissed me the F off. You know, it took a while, right? I was not like the sharpest knife in the drawer. But despite my passion for science, I became a feminist because of what kept happening to my body. And so I ended up being a left brain person in a right brain movement. Because the feminist movement is very touchy-feely. And I'm like, just tell me the problem so I can solve it, kind of thing. And so I have a very linear thinking process in a holistic movement, which is kind of interesting. But because of that, I was lucky enough to be one of 12 Black women who coined the concept of reproductive justice. And what happened was that we were at this conference at in Chicago, sponsored by the Illinois Pro-Choice Alliance. And I had gotten a scholarship to attend the conference from the Ms. Foundation because they had empowered 12 women of color to go to this conference, 12 Black women in particular, to go to this conference among 200 white women. And once we got there, the Clinton administration, and I'm talking about Bill Clinton, because we never had a Hillary Clinton administration, was proposing their version of healthcare reform, but they had decided on the strategy of omitting reproductive healthcare from healthcare reform because they thought that they could lessen Republican opposition to it. I'm not sure how well that was a strategy because I find Republicans mean, but not necessarily stupid. So I was like, well, but that's not the point. The point that struck us badly as Black women is our belief that reproductive health care is the main driver of women to the doctor. So if you omit reproductive health care from healthcare reform, you're basically at a feminist conference asking feminists to support a male-centric healthcare plan. That didn't make sense to us. And so we caucused in somebody's room. I think it was Abel Mabel Thomas, who was our state representative at the time, to decide what was our response going to be, but not to the conference, but to this whole proposal. And probably the white women thought we were caucusing about them because back then, every time women of color got together, they assumed they were the agenda that wasn't. But that's how kind of paranoid they might have been at the time. But we did caucus a lot of times and overturn white women's conferences, so they were right to be paranoid, probably. That's how the whole women of color movement was born. You know, meeting at these small little conferences, you know, as a caucus, and then hell, either blowing up the stage or forming our own. That's how Sister Song was born. But that wasn't the point. When we caucused in Mabel's room, we decided that we wanted to get Congress's attention. And so we decided to do a full-page signature ad in the Washington Post. And you can go back into the records August 16th, 1994, and find the ad called Black Women for Healthcare Reform. But we also knew that just lifting our voices in support of abortion rights was insufficient, because our problem with the pro-choice approach to abortion rights was the isolation of abortion from all the other human rights issues in a person's life. So as a matter of fact, the way we see it, every time a woman misses her period, she has that, oh my God moment, if she wasn't trying to get pregnant. Oh my God, can I stay in school? Oh my God, can I keep my job? Oh my God, what am I gonna tell my mama? What am I gonna tell my partner? Oh my God. And if you have bad answers to those oh my God questions, then an unanticipated pregnancy is going to probably end up in an abortion if it's accessible. But if you have good answers to the oh my God question, then an unanticipated pregnancy is probably going to end up in a baby. So we didn't like the fact that both the pro-choice and the pro-life movement started with the pregnancy. Why not move upstream and look at what's actually going on in the person's life? And so we spliced together the concept of social justice, which is all those other things going on in that person's life, with reproductive rights. And that's how we created the phrase reproductive justice, which was to embed the whole concept of abortion in a larger social justice framework. And then that was in June of 94. And in September of 94, there was an international conference on population and development in Cairo, Egypt. And I was lucky enough to have been one of the women who went to that. And what I discovered in Egypt was that the global conversation around women's health was about systemic and systematic and intentional underdevelopment. And so what they were saying, that the focus on population without accounting for intentional and systematic underdevelopment is population control. Instead of just talking about why women in the what was called the developing world back then, we call it the global south now, aren't using birth control or don't have access to birth control. Why aren't you asking why they don't even have a whole entire healthcare system in these countries? And what are those forces, which were then called structural adjustment policies, imposed by the World Bank and IMF, that keep them from developing their own economies, developing their own civil society, developing their own healthcare and education infrastructure. And so once we saw that conversation through the lens of human rights that women were having in the global south, I decided to attach that as the legal and moral and political framework underpinning reproductive justice. Because it was time for women in America to catch up to the global south, not the other way around. And so that's where it took off. And then 3 years later, we formed Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective with reproductive health at first, and then we renamed ourselves Reproductive Justice, which was a coalition of 16 women of color organizations, 4 Native American, 4 Asian Pacific Islander, 4 Latina, and 4 African American organizations. And then we ended up building a new movement for reproductive justice for women of color. Sister Song grew to 80 organizations, but we also found out that more women of color were not in women of color organizations than were in them. So we ended up being a hybrid federation. In other words, we were a federation of existing organizations, but we also had individual membership so that anybody could join Sister Song, even if they weren't coming through the portal of a women of color organization. And then in 2003, we had our first national conference, and we were surprised because we started planning for like 200 people to show up. Adrian, that was the conference you came to. And 600 people showed up. We ended up moving the conference in the last 2 weeks before the dang thing happened. We had our workshops at Spelman College, and we had to rent a ballroom at a hotel downtown to hold 600 people because Spelman didn't have a place big enough to hold 600 people at one time that was available to us. And so that's where we decided to test run the concept of reproductive justice. We liked it internally, but would it work externally to build a movement? And if you recall, Adrian, you were on that panel where I said, what is reproductive justice and what does it mean? And y'all did a wonderful job of persuading us that our own framework was a viable framework. And so then I probably should start closing down, but I want to just leave y'all with a basic core definition of reproductive justice, because I'm sure you know it already, but just in case. We join, the first tenet is the right not to have a child. And that's because we came to this whole discussion as both pro-choice and pro-life activists. There's both, all of those are in our DNA kind of thing, but we mean something different by pro-life, because I want to just clarify. The people that we work with who define themselves as pro-life are the people who basically say, I wouldn't have an abortion, but I wouldn't stop you from having one if that's what you want. And that's a pro-life position we can all basically get behind, because it's not about imposing their moral values on other people's bodies kind of thing. But we also, come from the pro-choice movement as well. So we fight equally hard for the right, like I said, not to have a child. And that overlaps us with the pro-choice movement, the right to use abortion, birth control, abstinence if you believe it works. I've never abstained from anything in my life, so I have no idea. It's just a theory for me, but people say it works. Anyway, that's our first tenet. Our second tenet, though, is based on our lived experiences as Black women, always being subjected to strategies of population control. And we always have to fight for the right to have the children that we want to have. And because our children, of course, are blamed for everything in the world that, white people say is wrong. Just leave it at that. And that's globally, by the way, it's not just locally, domestically. And so that leads to fighting for the right to have your birth plan respected. If you decide to get pregnant and go to the hospital, and fighting for the right to refuse an unnecessary cesarean, because there's a whole discourse that you can't have a vaginal birth after you've had a C-section and stuff like that, that we of course say is not necessarily true. Fighting for the right to have a midwife or a doula attendant in the birth, those kinds of things. And that's given rise to an entire birth justice movement, which we kind of see as like our sister movement, but fighting for that right to have a child. And then the third tenet of reproductive justice is the one that brings us in conversation with all the other human rights movement, because it's fighting for the right to raise our children in safe and healthy environments. And so, of course, that brings into conversation things like gun control, safe schools, affordable housing, environmental contaminations, whether or not women are discriminated in tax codes or, welfare policies, or, everything that humans touch. There's an issue of reproductive justice in it. Even how STEM is taught, you know what I mean? So that's probably the most capacious part of the framework. And we, as I said, base it on the human rights framework. So in closing, I want to talk about where my thinking has gone since 1994, because I've been really thinking about the concept of reproductive futurism. And I'm presently writing a journal article on that topic, because I think that if I project the reproductive justice framework into the future, I'm sorry. I'm at work, baby. I have to call you back. Sorry. My boyfriend calling. Anyway, he has the worst timing. Anyway, but if we take reproductive justice and project it into the future, what I see is that we have to fight techno-utopianism, because we have the developers of a lot of reproductive technologies promising this glorious, rosy. Wait a moment, I said no. Sorry. Promising this glorious. Let me turn this phone off. That would be the easiest way to tell him no. He's in another country, so it's hard for him to get the thing through WhatsApp. Anyway, moving right along. We have all of these scientists who I have a lot of support and sympathy for, actually designing people's reproductive futures. And in many ways, they're over promising what the technology can't even deliver. I mean, telling people that they can you know, select out certain genes and all this other stuff. They're over promising big time, but it's a very profitable market to promise people that they can get designer babies kind of thing. And that, of course, deals with egg harvesting and then even looking at the CRISPR technology where they're actually beginning to make modifications on the human genome and stuff like that. Well, as a reproductive justice activist, I'm going to ask the question whether or not with this techno-utopianism, have they considered techno-eugenics? And whether or not the old biases and inequalities of the past will just be upgraded with new science. Because we have a long history of the racialization of science and the damages that it can do. And so I'm writing a paper to explore that question, whether or not is reproductive justice a sturdy enough concept to look at the contestation between techno-utopianism and techno-eugenics. And so, anyway, let me shut up and see if there's any questions or you want to have dialogue, or if I said anything you disagree with. I love it when you disagree with me. I go on right-wing talk shows just for that reason. So,
Thank
any
you so much.
questions?
Thank you so much, Loretta. It's just gems. And I wanna make sure, folks have time to meditate on things and form questions as they come, because there's so much to dive deeper on. But I do have one particular question